Democratic elected leaders are actually calling for an insurrection, or as they call it, a revolution, as Fox News reports here, all over Roe v. Wade. But before we get into it, welcome to my channel. This is Bruce the Boss, and if you're not yet subscribed, go ahead and smash on that subscribe button. Your subscriptions do go a long way with allowing me to put out and produce more content, as well as beating the algorithms, allowing YouTube to promote and or push the video and or channel more so than they otherwise would, as it doesn't fall within their single narrative. And if you are already subscribed, don't forget to like this video, comment on this video, and all such interactions go a long way with, again, promoting the video and allowing it to be seen by others. And don't forget to smash on that notification bell so you can get notified of my latest content. Now let's get into this. So we have, again, like I said, an actual Democratic elected senator, Jeannie Shaheen of New Hampshire, calling for a revolution all over Roe v. Wade, which honestly I thought was a day that would never happen. But again, if you haven't been made aware, if you didn't know, it looks like the Supreme Court is doing the impossible. I always thought it was fear-mongering when politicians would say, if you elect George Bush, or if you, in the case that they did with Donald Trump, if you elect Donald Trump, they're going to overturn Roe v. Wade. And I'm thinking in my mind, that's never going to happen, fear-mongering. But it looks like Roe v. Wade will, in fact, be overturned very shortly by the Supreme Court, just a matter of time, days before they actually release the news, as the ruling opinion, majority opinion, has also been leaked. I'll be revealing that document as well later in the video, but let me just get into this story here. So it looks like there was a virtual event this past Monday featuring New Hampshire's entire House and Senate delegation. WMUR reporter Adam Sexton had asked if the public debate over abortion had been muted, and this was the senator's response. I hope the Supreme Court is listening to the people of the United States, because, to go back to Adam Sexton's question, I think if you want to see a revolution, go ahead and outlaw Roe v. Wade and see what happened, what the response is of the public, particularly young people, end quote, because I think that will not be acceptable to young women or young men, end quote.
This infringement on women, on our privacy, on the attempt to have state control of our personal health, really is what we would see in an authoritarian state. It's not what we would expect in New Hampshire. I think if you want to see a revolution, go ahead, outlaw Roe v. Wade, and see what the response is of the public, particularly young people.
I love for it. For one thing, and I would love to know what her historical response was to the jab mandate, but I find it very hypocritical from Democrats, no less, who are the ones pushing for and supporting jab mandates on the public, now at the same time are turning around and saying this should be a private decision between a patient and their doctor, that trying to get in between a private health decision of the government between the patient and the doctor is that of an authoritative state, and yet tried to push, again, through the government, mandatory jab mandates and or trying to coerce private companies, businesses, into doing so, into doing their bidding. Thank goodness for the overruling. And if you try to say, well, this is, when it came to COVID and the jab, that this was not private because you can infect others, come at me with, there are no facts supporting the idea that if you get jabbed, and I talked about this in other videos, that if you get jabbed, you don't spread it at all. That was a false narrative that was in fact pushed for the longest time in the beginning by Biden, by the mainstream media, by Rochelle Walensky of the CDC, but turned out to be completely false. There were several lab leaks that showed, that eventually became public knowledge, that the viral load in those jab versus unjab was exactly the same. Not to mention the fact that in every country, every county, every area that had a high jab rate, as early as the fall, had higher rates of infections than they ever had during the course of the pandemic, even without the jab being available. So how do you have higher infection rates amongst the jab versus those times prior to? it doesn't stop the spread. So it doesn't do anything other than possibly lessen your own symptoms, possibly. And it all depends on your age, because if you're someone like me in the 30s or even younger in their 20s, teens, and you weren't, by the way, overweight and or suffering from diabetes, you are unlikely to have severe symptoms. In fact, you are very unlikely to have symptoms to begin with, more likely to be asymptomatic. But that's another decision. But again, the whole jab thing is, you can't make that argument and support mandatory jabs when the jab did nothing to prevent transmission. Nothing at all. But I digress. And so now there's really making that argument. But what I also find very interesting is the fact that the very same people who were critical of the most lame insurrection in the history, unarmed, by the way, as well, where the only deaths that occurred were of that of Ashley Babbitt at the hands of the Capitol cop. And then Capitol Police who may have committed suicide after the fact and on a different day, but no actual death as a direct result of the actions that happened on January 6th. But the same people who were pushing insurrection on the masses for a year, and then an unarmed protest at best is what it was, that resulted in some fisticuffs at certain sections of the Capitol building, but others where police are clearly just letting people in. So those same people who were critical of that, of people who, a group of voters who felt frustrated, felt unheard, and felt like the system was trying to force through a process without actually examining all of the evidence and or hearing the cases and pleas of the people, that was bad. But we can do a revolution over this. Make that make sense. But I do feel as though once this gets overturned, as bad as the state of affairs are in what can easily be called the divided states of America, it's going to really push the talks of a civil, if not a peaceful divorce, push the talks of a cold civil war more so, which I believe we're actually already in. Just, again, a cold civil war, no guns being shot or fired, no one actually dying in conflict battle, but there does seem to be proxy wars, severe culture wars, and severe divisions amongst people in this country based upon the states that you live in, particularly, where you have one group of people who just absolutely hate the other side and cannot live and operate under the same country unless if everyone adheres to the same exact rules, regardless of where you are. And that's the funny thing about this Supreme Court decision. Now, if you haven't seen it, here is the leaked document from the majority court opinion on this from the Supreme Court as it pertains to Roe v. Wade. So it does appear, and this was just leaked earlier this week, created as of, as you can see, February 2022. It's a pretty big read. You're talking about 98 pages in all. But they do essentially get to their decision, which I believe, let me see, it was here on page 3, if I'm not mistaken. So they get into the history of Roe v. Wade. They do talk about how the initial decision of Roe v. Wade had pretty little to no bearing on the Constitution. For instance, here on page 2, they even say here that the court did not explain the basis for this line, and even abortion supporters have found it hard to defend Roe's reasoning. One prominent constitutional scholar wrote that he would vote for a statute very much like the one the court ended up with, referring to Roe v. Wade back in 1973, if he were a legislator. But his assessment of Roe was memorable and brutal. Roe was, and I quote, or as he quoted, not constitutional law at all, and gave almost no sense of obligation to try to be, end quote. So this is them really eviscerating Roe v. Wade's decision, that it had no constitutional basis in their opinion here. And then they go on more on page 3 here, referring to the Planned Parenthood of Southeastern Pennsylvania case versus Casey back in 1992, I believe it says here. Yep. And they said while the Casey case tried to make the case by linking the constitutionality of abortions to an amendment in the 14th Amendment. Let me try to find it here. So here we go on page 5. They refer to, here's what the Casey case in 1992 tried to do to attempt to make the constitutional argument that the due process clause of the 14th Amendment, that provision has been held to guarantee some rights that are not mentioned in the Constitution, but any such right must be deeply rooted in the nation's history and tradition and implicit in the concept of ordered liberty, end quote, referring to Washington v. Glucksberg in 1997. The right to abortion, however, and they further eviscerate that ruling, does not fall within this category until the latter part of the 20th century. Such a right was entirely unknown in American law. Indeed, the 14th Amendment was adopted. 3/4 of the states made abortion a crime at all stages of pregnancy. The abortion right is also critically different from any other right that this court has held to fall within the 14th Amendment's protection of quote-unquote liberty. Roe's defenders characterized the abortion right as similar to the rights recognized in past decisions involving matters such as intimate sexual relations, contraception, and marriage, but abortion is fundamentally different, as both Roe and Casey acknowledged, because it destroys what those decisions called fetal life and what the law now before us describes as unborn human being. So they're basically saying it does not fall within that purview because it was not really part of the nation's history and or a fundamental part of the nation's building. It was a relatively new concept. When Roe v. Wade came about, it came about literally not too long prior to that court ruling in the latter part of the 20th century, not even the whole part of the 20th century. We're not even talking about the early 19 teens or 1920s or 30s or 1940s. We're literally talking about the latter half of the 20th century. It was extremely new. And by the time of the Casey case, it was barely 20 years old or barely over 20 years old. So as they go on more so here, let me go to page 66. So here, actually on page 65 of the very long opinion in their decision that was ruled, they came to the decision that we therefore hold that the Constitution does not confer a right to abortion. Roe and Casey must be overruled, and the authority to regulate abortion must be returned to the people and their elected representative. So there you have it. They just have to make the public announcement or make it official. Somehow this was leaked. Not too sure how that happened, but this is what is going to eventually come out. The impossible did happen. Now, what I find interesting is that this is really the best compromise, because what they're effectively doing is they're leaving it up to the states and letting each state decide. And we already know what the laws on the books are for, I believe Virginia and New York. I may be confusing Virginia and Maryland. You can let me know in the comment section. Definitely I know New York already has laws on the books that essentially allows and legalize, and this was passed in their Senate and signed by state legislature and signed by the governor, essentially allowing and legalizing abortions up to the point of birth. And we all know California would also follow suit, maybe not to that extreme, but will follow suit in similar legislation, at least making sure that it is legal. And that was, I believe, the whole point of Texas's law up to, 16 weeks or 6 weeks, the heartbeat law here in Texas. That's what prompted them to do the heartbeat law, that if you can hear a heartbeat, they pretty much outlawed it legally. And particularly the case here in Mississippi that they're reviewing, which essentially I believe is 6 weeks. I think that is the one that's shorter. Texas at least waits until a heartbeat is heard. Mississippi basically says after 6 weeks or so, nada. So yeah, you're gonna have some states that will limit the ability, but you're gonna have other states that are out there that will make their decisions based upon what their people want, what their elected officials were asked to do by their constituents. Maybe not all of them, maybe not 100%, not even 90%, 80%, 70%, maybe more like 60-40 split, but majority nonetheless of what they want for their states. Leave it up to the states to decide what they want to do, like they do for almost everything, whether it be taxes, income tax, gun laws. That's all they want is let's compromise. Let's do what works best for the people of various states. But it seems like these Democrats want full control. They don't want to compromise. They want adherence across the country, full compliance, regardless of where you live. And I think that's kind of insane, especially for a party that's all about tolerance and acceptance of others, are unwilling to live and or accept a society or situation where there are people who don't fully submit to their worldview and or paradigm. It's just ridiculous, and that is in and of itself authoritarian, but it seems like everyone's heads are exploding over this. A lot of anger, again, and this could be a powder cake to potentially an actual revolution, only on their side, and I would love to see how that turns out. I mean, now this does look like it's going to happen. It's no if then. This is going to happen. It's just a matter of time. But I just, again, find it funny that the left does not want to compromise at all and say, leave it up to the states. And also let the people decide that if they don't like the laws in Mississippi or Alabama or Texas, they can go to California, New Jersey, New York. Don't know what Pennsylvania would do in this case. They can either relocate there permanently and or just travel there to have the medical procedure and then travel back. I don't think that their home state, if their home state outlaws it, has any jurisdiction over what happens in another state. And travel now is a lot easier and seems to be done a lot more by people of almost all social backgrounds and incomes, more so than what was capable back in the 1960s, 1970s. So it can still be done. You're not denying anyone's rights necessarily. They can still access those rights, just probably in another state at a different point in time. It is calling for a little bit more responsibility. The idea or concept that you're denying someone if they were raped or in cases of incest, which will also probably be likely raped by a family member, are still on the books in many of those states where it is restricted. Although let's not forget that even in today's world, that only happens to be the case less than 1% of all abortions. Less than 1%. That's been the case for at least the last 30 years, maybe more. That less than 1% were due to actual causes of rape and or incest. The other 99+% were just matters of convenience. And I find it funny then, but it will call for people to be a little bit more responsible with their actions, what they do or choose not to do or engage in, because it is the consequence, pregnancy of action that was voluntarily or usually consensually agreed upon. But that's another story for another day. But it does seem to be promoting the idea now of personal responsibility. And I find it interesting that a lot of these Democratic leaders and or commentators are now saying how this is going to destroy the country. Makes me wonder if there really is an operation of depopulation in this world. I already know about this country's history of eugenics programs, how up until the 1970s, up until 1976, I believe it was, 32 states in this country had legalized eugenics programs to sterilize so-called weak breeds, which not only included those who had mental issues, mental retardation, delayed development, but also targeted African Americans, Negroes, as they called us, at that time. And in fact, it was a Supreme Court case in 1972 involving two black girls, where their mother found out that her 11 and 12-year-old daughters were secretly sterilized or unknowingly sterilized by their doctor as part of the eugenics programs going on in this country secretly at that time. That they were somehow given a biased IQ test and labeled a little bit mentally slow and therefore justified their reasons. And this was happening to African Americans all over the country during the early 20th century, where they were given biased IQ tests, and then doctors were secretly sterilizing them. And how this mother eventually they discovered it in these girls was because of they were experiencing some unusual and severe stomach pains and cramps, and then eventually went to get tested, and that's when they found out it was the result of a botched or a reaction to a sterilization process that they had no idea was performed on them. So I know about this country's history. I know about Margaret Sanger and Planned Parenthood's initial goals to try to, again, depopulate the black population in this country, among other things. And that's sure enough what we've seen happen. More black women, more or less, abort their babies and their fetuses than give birth almost every single year. And then you wonder why the black population has not increased at all by any significant percentage. We've been at 11 or 12% of the country's population for like the last 100 years. Meanwhile, the Latino or Hispanic population in this country is growing exponentially during the same time period, to the point that in another 25, 30 years from now, so come 2052, they will make up the majority in this country. And yet our numbers remain stagnant. Why? Because of push abortions. And it does seem as though there is an agenda to depopulate this population, so to speak, that encourage people to have fewer and fewer kids. Look at the Avengers movie when I think about it. And Thanos' whole mission of stating that there's overpopulation and that's bad for the universe, bad for the planet, can't sustain it all, pushes to make people less confident, less enthusiastic of wanting to have kids, a more dire economy. That's why a lot of liberals have less and fewer kids, because they're not as optimistic about their futures, their abilities to support a family, raise a family on their own. Destroyed economies, preventing that as well. Why you have pushes for transgendering and or gender reassignment, because what a lot of people don't know is when you're going through that process, you're essentially sterilizing yourself and killing your ability to reproduce. That's something that I've recently found out that they don't really tell you. And they're pushing this, trying to push that agenda as well. So many small things done that seem to promote fewer and fewer families. It does seem like it might be ruining people's plans of depopulation, so to speak. But that's just another random thought. I don't want to go too far off tangent, but let me know what you think in the comment section below. Like this video. I would love to know your thoughts. Will this lead to or be the powder cake that explodes this country and really leads to, if not more of a cold civil war, an actual civil war? Will there be an insurrection? And if so, will any of these Democratic leaders be held responsible for their rhetoric the same way they're trying to hold Republicans responsible for what happened on January 6th? All right, a lot going on, major changes. All right, this is Bruce the Boss, and I'm out. Peace.